When someone vanishes without a trace, we assume the worst. The case goes cold and they are presumed gone forever. But sometimes, the impossible happens. Today, we're covering the 10 most disturbing cases of people who disappeared only to reappear years later. These stories completely defy logic. If you love deep dives into the mysteries, please take a second to hit subscribe and give hype points. Now, question everything and let's get into it. Think about your own neighborhood for a second. The houses around you, the fences you walk past every day, the places you glance at without really looking. Now imagine that behind one of those fences, not in a remote cabin, not in a desert bunker, not in some abandoned warehouse, but right there, in a regular suburban backyard in a regular California neighborhood, a woman and 2 children have been living as prisoners for 18 years, inside a hidden compound of tarps and sheds, just on the other side of the wood. And parole officers, actual state-employed, trained parole officers, have been walking into that yard for years and not seeing them. This is the Jaycee Dugard case, and the horror of it isn't hidden in the shadows of a forest somewhere. The horrors that the system you believe is watching out for you looked directly at this crime for almost 2 decades and somehow, impossibly, missed it. Let me take you to the morning of June 10th, 1991, South Lake Tahoe, California. If you've never been there, picture it. It's alpine, it's gorgeous, pine trees everywhere, snow-capped peaks in the distance, crisp mountain air, quiet streets. This is the kind of community where people move specifically because they want their kids to grow up somewhere safe. The vibe is peaceful, almost impossibly wholesome. Parents here let their children walk to school by themselves without a second thought. Because why wouldn't they? It's a Monday morning, a school day, and 11-year-old Jaycee Lee Dugard is walking down Washone Boulevard toward her school bus stop. She's in 5th grade. She's wearing a pink windbreaker, backpack on her shoulders. She's thinking about whatever 11-year-olds think about on the walk to school: breakfast, friends, homework. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, is keeping an eye on her from a short distance away. He's on a bicycle, just watching her reach the bus stop safely, like parents do. That's the baseline here. This is a family and a community that takes care of its kids. Nothing about this morning suggests what's about to happen. And then a gray sedan pulls up. What happens next takes seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The car slows next to Jaycee. The passenger window comes down, and before she can react, she's hit with a stun gun. She collapses. The door opens. Hands grab her. She's pulled into the vehicle. Carl, her stepfather, sees it happen from down the street. He sees his daughter get attacked and yanked into a car. He jumps on his bike and tries to chase the vehicle, but he's on a bicycle. They're in a car. The car accelerates, and just like that, in broad daylight, on a quiet suburban street, Jaycee Dugard is gone. The people in the car are Philip and Nancy Garrido. What follows is one of the largest manhunts in California history. Local police, state investigators, the FBI, all of them throw everything they have at this case. Missing posters blanket the community. Bloodhounds work the woods. Thousands of tips pour into the switchboards. The face of Jaycee Dugard, that innocent little girl in the pink windbreaker, becomes burned into the American consciousness, and the trail goes cold, completely cold, for 18 years. Now, where do you picture a kidnapped child being held for 18 years? You think remote. You think isolated. You think a cabin deep in the woods, or a trailer in the desert, or some abandoned property miles from the nearest human being. You don't picture Antioch, California. You don't picture a suburban neighborhood with houses right next to each other, neighbors on every side, delivery trucks coming and going, kids playing in the street. But that's exactly where Philip Garrido took her. To his regular suburban house, in a regular suburban neighborhood, and behind that house, in the backyard, he had built a compound, a warren of sheds and tents and tarps concealed behind a fence, including a makeshift soundproof recording studio. That's where Jaycee Dugard lived, from age 11 to age 29. During those 18 years, she was sexually abused, repeatedly. She gave birth to 2 daughters fathered by Philip Garrido, the first when she was 14, the second when she was 17. Those 2 girls were raised entirely inside the backyard compound. They had no birth certificates, no social security numbers, no pediatrician, no school. They did not officially exist to the state of California or the United States of America. And then, in August of 2009, after 18 years of complete invisibility, Philip Garrido did something baffling. He decided to visit the UC Berkeley campus to hand out religious pamphlets. And he brought Jaycee's 2 daughters with him. Campus police officer Allie Jacobs noticed the girls. She said later that something about them felt off. They were unusually pale. They seemed robotic, subservient, wrong. She ran Garrido's name and found out he was a registered sex offender on federal parole for a previous kidnapping and rape. She called his parole officer and insisted something needed to be checked. 2 days later, Garrido was ordered to report to the parole office. He brought his entire family, including, for the first time in public, Jaycee herself. Under interrogation, the lies fell apart. Jaycee finally admitted who she really was, 18 years, over in a single afternoon. Okay, now let's actually talk about the part of this case that makes people furious, because the rescue is a miracle, but what it exposed is a scandal. Philip Garrido was not some off-grid ghost operating under the radar. He was a registered sex offender. He was on federal parole. He had already served time for a kidnapping and rape that was public record. The system knew exactly who this man was, and the system had an obligation to supervise him. Parole officers visited his home repeatedly for years. Compliance checks. That's their entire job, to make sure convicted sex offenders aren't doing the exact thing Philip Garrido was doing. And for 18 years, those visits missed everything. How? How does that happen? How do trained parole officers walk onto a property and fail to notice a sprawling compound of tents and sheds in the backyard? How do they not ask, what's behind that fence? How do they not walk 10 feet around the side of the house and look? I'm not asking a rhetorical question. I genuinely want to understand, mechanically, how a trained officer completes a home visit and leaves without inspecting the yard of a known sex offender. This wasn't a hidden basement. This wasn't a secret room behind a bookshelf. This was a backyard, with canvas tarps visible from above, with a woman and 2 children living inside, and the people paid by the state of California to watch Philip Garrido manage to not see any of it for almost 2 decades. Now add the neighbors. Because Antioch is a suburb, people live on either side of the Garrido house. People walk their dogs past that property. Mail carriers deliver to it. How do you raise 2 children in a backyard tent compound in a suburban neighborhood without a single neighbor reporting a crying baby? An odd smell, a weird tarp structure, a child's voice where no child should be. How does that level of suburban density coexist with that level of invisible captivity for 18 years? And then there's the hardest question of all, the psychological one. Toward the later years of her captivity, Jaycee was occasionally allowed outside the compound. She did some work for Philip Garrido's printing business. She interacted with his clients. She was, at times, visible, in public, with strangers. Why didn't she scream? That's the instinctive question. And it's the wrong question, because it assumes Jaycee was the person she'd been at 11. She wasn't. She'd been taken at 11, abused for years, told her family had forgotten about her, isolated from every human being who had ever loved her, and forced to become a mother as a teenager to protect children fathered by her captor. By the time she was visible to strangers, the walls holding her weren't physical anymore. They were inside her head. 18 years of psychological conditioning had turned escape itself into a terrifying concept. While Philip Garrido had convinced her the outside world was dangerous, he'd convinced her that her daughter's safety depended on her compliance. He'd rewired her survival instincts. The physical prison became a mental one, and mental prisons are much, much harder to walk out of. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life. Nancy Garrido got 36 years. They will both die in prison, which is exactly where they belong. The state of California paid a $20 million settlement to Jaycee and her daughters for the catastrophic failures of its parole system. Because make no mistake, that's what enabled this. Not the shadows, not some criminal genius. It was the bureaucratic indifference of a system that had its eyes on Philip Garrido and still let him keep 3 human beings captive in his backyard for 18 years. And Jaycee Dugard? She did something almost nobody expects from a survivor of that length and intensity of abuse. She rebuilt. She wrote 2 best-selling memoirs, A Stolen Life and Freedom, My Book of Firsts, describing her captivity and her return in her own voice, on her own terms. She founded the Jaycee Foundation to help families recovering from severe trauma. She uses equine therapy. She advocates for other survivors. She refused to let Philip Garrido keep her identity after she got her body back. But here's the thing this case leaves you with, the reason it still matters decades later. We tend to imagine monsters as something exotic, something distant, something that lives in the woods or in bunkers or in caves, something we'd recognize if we saw it. The Dugard case destroys that fantasy. The monster wasn't hidden. The monster lived in a house on a suburban street with neighbors and a mailbox and a parole officer checking in on him. He was known, registered, supervised, and still, for 18 years, he held 3 human beings captive behind a fence while the system that was supposed to watch him did its paperwork and left without looking. The scariest part of this story isn't that Jaycee was taken. The scariest part is how she was kept, in plain sight, in a normal neighborhood, in a backyard visible from the sky. While authorities came and went and asked all the wrong questions, she didn't vanish into the wilderness. She vanished into a fenced yard in Antioch, California, with people living all around her, and nobody looked over the fence for 18 years. That's the haunting lesson of the Jaycee Dugard case. It's not about the woods. It's about the fence next door. And the question you can't stop asking after you hear her story is the one that probably saved nobody in 1991, but might save someone now. What's behind the fence? Picture a regular city street. Houses pressed right up against each other. Porches where people sit in the summer. Kids on bikes. Neighbors who know each other's names. The hum of a working-class neighborhood where nothing seems remarkable and nothing seems hidden. Now, imagine that for 10 years, in one of those houses, behind boarded-up windows and chained doors, 3 women are being held captive. A musician lives in that house. He hosts band practice. He throws family barbecues in the backyard. He attends community events. He even passes out missing person flyers for one of the girls he's keeping chained in his basement. And nobody notices. For a decade. This is the case of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight. And it's not a story about a remote cabin or an isolated bunker. It's about the terrifying realization that a human being can be erased from the world while remaining physically present in a crowded city block. Let me take you to the Tremont neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. Early 2000s. This is a working-class enclave, predominantly Hispanic, tight-knit with houses practically stacked on top of each other, front porches nearly touching, narrow streets, the kind of place where neighbors watch each other's kids and wave from across the fence. The backdrop here is Rust Belt urban life. Not glamorous, not wealthy, but lived in. Loud, full of community. This is not the kind of neighborhood where someone could vanish without people noticing, or so you'd think. Between 2002 and 2004, 3 young women go missing from this exact area. Just blocks apart. August 23rd, 2002. Michelle Knight, 21 years old. She's only 4'7", which earned her the nickname Shorty. She's had a hard life, bullied in school, assaulted at 17, and recently lost custody of her toddler son to foster care. On the day she vanishes, she's leaving a cousin's house, devastated about her son. She never makes it home. April 21st, 2003. Amanda Berry, 16 years old, the day before her 17th birthday. Amanda is the responsible one. She has a part-time job at Burger King on Lorraine Avenue. That evening, she finishes her shift, calls her sister at 8 p.m. to say she's getting a ride home, and then she just doesn't show up. April 2nd, 2004. Gina DeJesus, 14 years old, a middle schooler walking home from class. Gina's family is deeply rooted in the community, Spanish-speaking, closely connected, absolutely not a runaway situation. She's walking one moment and gone the next. 3 vanishings, same neighborhood, same pattern, within blocks of each other. Now here's where the case gets dark in ways that are hard to process. Michelle Knight's disappearance barely registers. Because of her troubled history, police eventually remove her from the FBI missing persons database in 2003, assuming she ran off. She is written off by the very system designed to find her. Amanda Berry's disappearance gets far more attention. Her mother, Luana Miller, refuses to let it go. She fights for media coverage, pushes for search efforts, becomes the face of a grieving, relentless mother. But Amanda stays gone. And tragically, Luana dies of heart failure years later, never learning the truth. She goes to her grave believing her daughter is dead. Gina DeJesus's disappearance devastates the neighborhood. Vigils are held. Flyers go up. Her family pours everything into the search. And standing right there in the crowd, holding flyers, passing out missing posters, attending search vigils, comforting Gina's mother, is the man responsible. His name is Ariel Castro. He's a former school bus driver, a local musician, an acquaintance of the DeJesus family, Gina's friend's father. While Gina's mother is sobbing for her missing daughter, Castro is literally hugging her, and Gina is chained in his basement. All 3 women, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, are being held captive inside 2207 Seymour Avenue, a regular-looking 2-story house in Tremont, with boarded-up windows on the inside that looked normal from the street. Behind those walls, locked inner doors, chains, darkness, and psychological warfare so extreme it's hard to describe. The women are forbidden from using their real names. Gina is forced to adopt the alias Chelsea, named after a soap opera character. She gradually loses the ability to speak Spanish, her native language. Michelle, who endures the most severe abuse, becomes a kind of protector. She keeps the others going. In December 2006, Amanda Berry gives birth to a daughter inside that house, in a plastic wading pool, with Michelle acting as the makeshift midwife, threatened with death if the baby doesn't survive. Michelle performs CPR on the newborn and saves the baby's life. That moment, that act of heroism inside a house of horrors, forges a bond between these 3 women that nothing could break. And then, 10 years after Michelle was first taken, on May 6, 2013, Ariel Castro makes a mistake. He leaves the house for a short errand, and he forgets to lock the heavily secured inner door. The outer storm door is still locked, but the inner door, the one that had always kept the women sealed away, is open. Amanda notices. She doesn't know how long she has. She grabs her 6-year-old daughter. She runs to the front door and starts kicking at the bottom of the storm door, screaming through the screen. Across the street, a neighbor named Charles Ramsey is eating at McDonald's on his porch. He hears the screaming. He runs over. Another neighbor, Angelo Cordero, joins him. Together they kick out the bottom panel of the door, and Amanda crawls through with her daughter. She runs to a neighbor's house and calls 911, and what she says is one of the most unforgettable 911 calls ever recorded. "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped. I've been missing for 10 years. And I'm here. I'm free now." Within hours, police breach the house. They find Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus still inside. Ariel Castro is arrested that evening. Okay, let's talk about how this happened, because the logistics of this case are almost incomprehensible. Ariel Castro wasn't a recluse. He wasn't off-grid. He wasn't hiding. He was an active member of his community. He played bass in local bands. Musicians came to his house to practice. Think about that for a second. People walked into that house, into the living room, into the main floor, and sat around, drank beers, played music, while 3 women were locked in rooms just feet away. How do you hide 3 captive human beings in a house where people come and go for band practice? How do you keep them silent while there's a drum kit pounding in the living room? How do you manage the logistics of feeding them, of hiding evidence, of maintaining the fiction without anyone ever stumbling into the wrong room? Castro hosted family gatherings, backyard barbecues, relatives visited. His daughter, Ariel Castro's own daughter, who was actually a close childhood friend of Gina DeJesus, came to the house. She had no idea her missing childhood friend was chained somewhere in the same building as her father. And the neighbors? Over the years, people reported seeing weird things. There were claims of strange activity. Women crawling in the backyard, pounding noises on the doors, glimpses through windows that didn't match what should have been inside. Some of these reports were allegedly made to police. Officers visited the house a handful of times over the decade for unrelated matters. And the women stayed lost. Think about what that means. Rescue was inches away, multiple times. A cop standing at the front door, a neighbor peering over a fence, a visitor walking through the hallway. The people who could have saved Amanda and Gina and Michelle were physically within arm's reach of them, and the system failed to connect the dots every single time. But here's the part of this case that I can't stop thinking about. The psychological part. After 10 years of locked doors, after 10 years of chains, after 10 years of being told you're worthless, forgotten, that nobody is looking for you, that you'll die in this house, after giving birth in a plastic pool, after watching your own children grow up inside a nightmare. Amanda Berry still had it in her to recognize, in one specific moment on a specific Tuesday afternoon, that this was the day, that the door was slightly loose, that she had a window of seconds, maybe a minute before Castro came back, that if she hesitated, she'd die in that house. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her daughter, she kicked, she screamed, she broke out. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's a decade of quiet, crushed, invisible strength that refused to die. And when the one crack opened, she was ready. Michelle Knight had kept herself alive through unimaginable abuse by finding purpose in protecting the others. Gina DeJesus had survived being stripped of her name, her language, her identity, and Amanda Berry had carried a child through captivity and raised her in the dark until the moment she could carry her into the light. That's not survival. That's defiance. Ariel Castro was charged with 977 counts, which he eventually pleaded guilty to over 900 of, to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. 1 month into his sentence, he was found dead in his cell. He hanged himself, the coward's exit from a punishment he had earned 1,000 times over. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished almost immediately. Nobody wanted it standing. Nobody wanted it becoming a dark tourist attraction or a shrine for the wrong kind of visitor. They knocked it down and left the lot empty. But Gina DeJesus did something remarkable. She refused to let Seymour Avenue stay defined by what had happened there. She founded a grassroots nonprofit for missing persons, the Cleveland Family Center for Missing Children and Adults, and she located it on Seymour Avenue, deliberately, stubbornly, reclaiming the street that had tried to swallow her. All three women wrote memoirs. They gave interviews. They became, in their own ways, symbols of what human beings can endure and still come out the other side. The terrible lesson of this case is that monsters don't always hide in isolated places. Sometimes they host barbecues. Sometimes they attend the vigils for the children they've kidnapped. Sometimes they live on streets where the neighbors look over the fence and the cops come to the door and the musicians play in the living room. And somehow the captives behind the wall stay invisible for a decade. But the triumphant part of this case, the part that matters more than the horror, is that the three women on Seymour Avenue did not die in that house. They walked out. They grew up. They rebuilt. Amanda Berry's 911 call ended with one of the most powerful sentences in American crime history. I'm free now. 10 years of silence, one kicked-in door, 3 lives that refused to stay buried, and a street in Cleveland that used to mean horror now means something else entirely. It means hope. It means the door was always there, somewhere, and eventually someone kicked through it. Amanda, Michelle, Gina. They walked out of that house, and nothing about their survival was luck. It was the quietest, most stubborn form of courage imaginable, waiting, watching, enduring until the moment the door cracked open, and then running. Imagine being told at 7 years old that your mom and dad gave you away because they couldn't afford you anymore, that you belong to someone new now, that your old name isn't your real name, that the people you called mom and dad your entire life just handed you over and walked away. Now imagine believing it, because you're 7. And the adult telling you this is the only adult in your world. That was Stephen Stayner's reality. For 7 years, he wasn't locked in a basement, he wasn't chained in a shed. He went to public school, he played with neighborhood kids, he drank sodas on the porch, and during all of that, he carried a fiction inside his head that was heavier than any physical prison, the belief that his real family didn't want him anymore. This is the story of how a 14-year-old boy finally broke that fiction. Not to save himself, but to save someone else. And it's also the story of how saving a little boy's life came at a cost that would haunt the Stayner family in ways nobody could have predicted. Let me take you to Merced, California, December 4th, 1972. A quiet, mild Monday afternoon in a sleepy Central Valley town. This is the early 70s, and if you've heard stories from people who grew up in that era, you know the vibe. Kids walked to school unsupervised. They rode bikes for miles without anyone checking on them. Front doors were left unlocked. Nobody had cell phones. Nobody had stranger danger drills. The phrase helicopter parent didn't exist yet because nobody needed it. Communities trusted each other. Adults were, by default, assumed to be safe. It was the last breath of an era. And Stephen Stayner was about to become one of the reasons that era ended. Stephen was 7 years old, the third of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner, friendly, compliant, deeply trusting, the way a 7-year-old in 1972 was raised to be trusting. He was walking home from his elementary school that afternoon, doing exactly what he did every day, completely at ease on familiar streets, and a man pulled up in a white Buick. The man was Irvin Edward Murphy, an associate of a convicted child molester named Kenneth Parnell. Murphy rolled down the window and claimed he was a church worker collecting donations. He asked Stephen if he could guide him to his house so he could speak with his parents. Stephen, being a helpful kid raised in an era that valued politeness to adults, said sure. He got in the car. That was the last moment of his original life. Kenneth Parnell took Stephen to a cabin in Cathy's Valley, California. And here's a detail that is almost unbearable to think about. That cabin was located just a few hundred feet from Stephen's own maternal grandfather's home. He was that close to rescue, that close to family, and he had no idea. What followed was not a typical captivity story. Parnell didn't chain Stephen in a cellar, he didn't lock him in a basement, he did something arguably more devastating. He rewrote the child's identity from the ground up. He told Stephen that his parents couldn't afford him anymore, that they had given him away, that Parnell now had legal custody of him. He changed Stephen's name to Dennis Parnell. He introduced him to neighbors and teachers as his son. He moved him between counties, Mariposa, Mendocino, to avoid building a consistent paper trail anyone could question. And as the years went by, something bizarre happened. The physical captivity loosened. Parnell started letting Stephen attend public schools. He let him make friends. By his teenage years, Stephen was allowed near total freedom of movement. He drank, he smoked cigarettes, he hung out in the community. He came and went. Because Parnell had figured out that the locks in Stephen's head were stronger than any locks in a cabin could ever be. And during those 7 years, Stephen did something quietly extraordinary. When Parnell would try to lure other young boys, and he did try multiple times, Stephen actively sabotaged those attempts. He warned kids off. He got in the way. He protected other children even while he himself was trapped. He never fully broke. There was a core of moral refusal inside him that Parnell couldn't erode. Then, in February 1980, Parnell brought home a new victim, a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White. Stephen was 14 at this point. He had spent 7 years believing his family didn't want him. 7 years becoming Dennis. 7 years accepting his fate. But the moment little Timmy White walked into the house, something shifted. Because Stephen knew. He knew exactly what was going to happen to that little boy. He had lived it. On March 1st, 1980, Parnell was working a night security shift. Stephen made his decision. He took 5-year-old Timmy, snuck out of the house, and started walking. He hitchhiked. He walked miles through the dark. He kept Timmy calm and moving. And eventually, exhausted, they reached a police station in Ukiah, California. Stephen walked in and told the officers who Timmy was. And then the officers asked, Who are you? And after 7 years of being called Dennis, of being told he belonged to someone else, of being programmed to believe his real family had thrown him away, Stephen looked up and said, "I know my first name is Stephen." That sentence became one of the most famous lines in American true crime history, because inside those 7 words was the sound of a boy clawing his way back to his own identity. Okay, let's talk about why this case is so psychologically disturbing. Because the obvious question people ask is, why didn't Stephen just run? He was in public schools, he had teachers, he had neighbors, he had classmates, he had opportunities, hundreds of them, to walk up to any adult and say, "I'm kidnapped. My name is Stephen Stayner. My family is in Merced. Help me." He didn't. For 7 years. And if you're looking at this from the outside, that seems impossible. But here's the thing. Physical chains and mental chains are completely different animals, and mental chains are so much harder to break. Think about what Parnell did. He got hold of a 7-year-old kid, a child whose entire world was his family, and he told that child over and over that his family had given him away, that his parents had stopped loving him, that he was a burden they couldn't carry anymore, that he now belonged to Parnell. A 7-year-old brain can't fight that. A 7-year-old doesn't have the life experience to say, that's a lie. A 7-year-old trusts adults. Parnell weaponized that trust and rewrote reality. And once Stephen believed, really believed, that his family didn't want him, where was he supposed to run? Home? Home had rejected him. That was the story in his head. Going back meant knocking on a door that wouldn't open, facing parents who had supposedly chosen to get rid of him. That kind of rejection, for a child, feels worse than staying in captivity. So he stayed. Not because he was physically trapped, because the mental architecture of his identity had been rebuilt around a lie. Now, think about the night he escaped. He wasn't escaping for himself. By 14, he had accepted his life. He had made peace with being Dennis. The hero's journey here doesn't start with self-preservation. It starts with altruism. Stephen saw Timmy White and realized, maybe for the first time since he was 7, that the thing being done to him was wrong, not complicated, not morally gray, wrong. And if it was wrong, then the entire foundation of the last 7 years was wrong. And Timmy was about to live the same nightmare unless Stephen acted. He didn't escape to reclaim his own life. He escaped to save a little boy's. That's the psychological inversion that makes this story so haunting. Stephen had given up on himself, but he hadn't given up on the principle of saving a child. And then there's the systemic failure, which is its own kind of horror. How did Kenneth Parnell enroll a kidnapped child into multiple California public schools? How did he register Dennis Parnell with teachers, school nurses, administrators, all without a legitimate birth certificate, medical records, or verifiable history? How did nobody at any point look at the paperwork and say, wait, this doesn't add up? The answer is that the system in the 1970s ran on trust. The adults vouched for children, and institutions took their word for it. Parnell walked a kidnapped child through the California school system for years, and the bureaucracy just accepted him. That's not a flaw. That's a gaping hole big enough for a predator to walk a stolen child through for the better part of a decade. Stephen came home to Merced in 1980 as a national hero. His escape, his courage, and that unforgettable line, "I know my first name is Stephen," became part of American pop culture. A TV movie was made about his story, but the reintegration was brutal. Stephen came home as a chain-smoking 14-year-old who had lived something his family couldn't comprehend. And his parents, understandably, still pictured him as the 7-year-old they had lost. That gap was unbridgeable. He clashed with his father. He felt disconnected. He was bullied mercilessly at school because everyone knew the details of what he had suffered, and the justice system failed him again. Because of statute of limitations issues and jurisdictional gaps, Kenneth Parnell was initially sentenced to just 7 years in prison. He served 5. Stephen had been held captive for 7 years. His kidnapper got out in 5. And on September 16, 1989, Stephen Stayner was killed in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident. He was 24 years old. He left behind a wife and 2 young children. But the darkest footnote to the Stayner family story came a decade later. Stephen's older brother, Cary Stayner, had grown up in the shadow of Stephen's disappearance, the media frenzy, and everything the family endured. And in 1999, Cary Stayner committed a series of murders near Yosemite National Park. 4 women. And he became known as the Yosemite serial killer. True crime analysts have debated ever since whether Cary's pathology was somehow connected to the catastrophic trauma that Stephen's kidnapping inflicted on the family. Whether a second tragedy grew silently inside that household while everyone's attention was on Stephen. There's no clean answer. Only the chilling coincidence that one family produced both a national hero and a serial killer. But Stephen Stayner's legacy doesn't belong to Cary. It doesn't even belong to Kenneth Parnell, or to the school system that failed him, or to the statute of limitations that undercut his justice. Stephen Stayner's legacy is one night, one window, one 14-year-old boy carrying a 5-year-old boy through the California dark, miles of highway, terror on every side. Walking toward a police station he couldn't fully picture. A boy who had been told for 7 years that nobody wanted him. A boy who believed that lie all the way down to his bones. A boy who, in the moment that mattered most, chose to save someone else, even though he had long since stopped believing he was worth saving. That is heroism, not the movie kind, the real kind. The kind that walks into a police station, looks up at an officer, and remembers its own name out loud. I know my first name is Stephen. 7 words, 7 years, and one little boy saved because another kid refused to let the cycle continue. That's what he left behind. Imagine you disappear at 13. Your family thinks you're dead. The police dig up your childhood backyard looking for your bones, and 22 years later, you walk back into their lives and say, "I'm here, I'm Mary, I'm alive," and your own sister looks at you and says, "No, you're not. Not a stranger, not a cop. Your sister. The person who shared a childhood with you, the person who knew your secrets." She looks at your face, the face you've been carrying around your whole life, and tells the police you're a liar trying to steal a dead girl's name. This is the case of Mary Louise Day, and it's one of the rare disappearances where even DNA couldn't fully close the wound. Let me take you to Seaside, California. 1981. A coastal military town on the central California coast, the kind of place where soldiers from Fort Ord come and go. And families drift in and out, and nobody really knows their neighbors for long. The macro setting sounds fine. Pacific breeze, sleepy houses, quiet streets. But here's the thing. The real atmosphere of this story isn't the town. It's inside one specific house. And inside that house, the environment is a powder keg. Mary Day was 13 years old. She'd had a brutal start in life. Born in upstate New York, she and her 2 younger sisters, Kathy and Sherry, spent their early years bouncing through the foster care system because of severe neglect from their mother, Charlotte. Eventually, Charlotte got them back, and then married a soldier named William Hoole. And William, by multiple accounts, was violently abusive. The kind of stepfather who ran the house like a boot camp with rage instead of rules. Mary tried to protect her younger sisters, while she and Kathy even developed a secret code word, Mohawk, so they could talk about an inheritance from their deceased biological father without the parents overhearing. They were plotting their escape. They were trying to get out. By December of 1980, the abuse was so severe that Mary got briefly placed in protective custody. And then, and this is the part that breaks your heart, she was returned to the home. Right back into the house she'd been rescued from. Just in time for what was coming next. July 15th, 1981. A night of absolute chaos inside the Hoole household. William accuses Mary of poisoning the family dog. He attacks her viciously. Her sister Kathy later says she heard all hell break loose and saw Mary bleeding from the mouth. And then Mary is gone. But here's the first thing that should set off every alarm in your head. Thus, Mary's parents do not report her missing. Not that night, not that week, not that year. They just tell the other kids she ran away and forbid them from ever speaking her name again. She is erased from the family conversation like she never existed. For over a decade, Mary Day is simply unmentioned. Not alive, not dead, just forbidden. It isn't until the early 1990s that her sister Sherry, now an adult, no longer under the parents' thumb, finally walks into a police station and says, "My sister has been missing for 10 years and nobody ever reported it." And that's when the real investigation starts. By 2002, Seaside police are treating this as a cold case homicide. The prime suspect is William Hoole. Investigators learn things that make them physically ill. Charlotte, the mother, tells her daughter Sherry that she knows locations where a body could be hidden forever. William himself gives police the most chilling statement imaginable. He says he didn't kill Mary, but the demon inside of him might have. Charlotte claims she saw Satan in William's eyes the night Mary disappeared. And there's one more detail. For years, William had expressly forbidden the children from playing in a specific, secluded corner of the backyard. So when police bring in cadaver dogs in 2002, and they release those dogs at the old family home, all 4 dogs independently alert on that exact corner. And when investigators dig, they find a single, small child's tennis shoe. Everything is lining up. Everything says Mary is buried somewhere, and William Hoole killed her. Police are preparing to close the net. A homicide arrest feels imminent. And then, on November 25th, 2003, a routine traffic stop in Arizona. An officer pulls over a woman, runs her ID, and the name that comes back is Mary Louise Day, the murdered 13-year-old, alive. 22 years later, in Arizona, she's flown back to her family in California, and the reunion is nothing like anyone pictured, because the woman who steps off that plane has a thick, deep Southern drawl. She's been using strange aliases. One of them is Monica Devereaux. Her Arizona state ID was issued only 3 weeks before the traffic stop, which feels suspiciously convenient. And when her sister Kathy asks her about their secret childhood code word, Mohawk, the word they swore they'd remember forever, the woman has no idea what Kathy is talking about. Kathy looks at this stranger standing in front of her, and she says to the police, to her family, to anyone listening, "That is not my sister." Okay, let's pick this apart. Because on the surface, the sisters are right. Every single piece of evidence screams imposter. Start with the accent, a thick Southern drawl. Mary Day was born in New York, raised in California. She never lived in the South. She disappeared at 13. And here's the thing about accents. Linguists will tell you that by your early teens, your accent is basically locked in. You can soften it, sure. You can pick up a twang if you move somewhere new. But to completely swap a California-New York baseline for a deep South drawl? That's not normal. That's not how human speech patterns work. That single detail alone was enough to convince Mary's own sisters that this woman was a con artist. Now add the memory problems. The missing code word. The aliases. The suspiciously new Arizona ID issued right as the homicide investigation was closing in on her stepfather. It looked like a setup. It looked like someone had researched the case, figured out the cops were about to arrest William Hoole for murder, and swooped in to play the role of the resurrected victim to derail the trial. Which brings us to the question that really breaks the imposter theory apart. Why would anyone pretend to be Mary Day? Think about it. If you're a con artist, you steal identities that come with something: money, property, a trust fund, access, status, something you can exploit. Mary Day had none of that. She came from a broken, abusive family. She had no inheritance waiting for her. She had no rich relatives. The only thing her identity came with was a traumatized sister and a stepfather about to be arrested for murder. What do you gain by pretending to be her? A felony charge for impersonation, a hostile family, a cold trail in Arizona? The financial motive is zero. The social motive is zero. The only possible motive is derailing the murder trial, but that assumes the imposter is somehow working on behalf of William Hoole, which nobody has ever been able to connect. So the logic cuts both ways. The evidence says she's fake, but the incentive to fake it doesn't exist, which is why the police finally did the one thing that could settle this. They ran a DNA test comparing the Arizona woman to Charlotte Hoole, her alleged biological mother. The results came back. It was a match. She was Mary Day. And that's where the case breaks open into something genuinely disturbing. Because the biological question got answered, yes, this woman is Mary, but every psychological question it raised just got louder. If she is Mary Day, then where was she for 22 years? Why does she have a Southern accent? Why doesn't she remember Mohawk? Why can't she account for the time between 1981 and 2003? And the answer, as best as anyone could reconstruct, was devastating. Mary had run away that night, not been murdered. She'd fled the beating in July of 1981 and disappeared into the transient underclass of American life. Homelessness, abuse, alcoholism, moving from place to place, from one bad situation to the next for 2 decades. The trauma she experienced during those years was so severe, so prolonged, that it essentially wiped her autobiographical memory. Her accent shifted, her identity fractured, her memories dissolved. She wasn't an imposter. She was a survivor so damaged by her own life that she couldn't prove who she was, even to the people who shared her DNA. And even after the DNA match, some people never fully believed. The lead detective reportedly still had doubts. Mary's sister Sherry remained haunted, because the woman who came back wasn't really the Mary they remembered. Something essential, call it memory, call it personality, call it soul, had been lost out there in those 22 invisible years. Mary spent the rest of her life in Missouri, plagued by violent suicide attempts and illness, and in 2017, she died at the age of 49. The final cruel detail? Her neighbors in Missouri reportedly didn't even bother to inform her family until after the fact. She died alone, or effectively alone, still carrying a history nobody could access, including her. So here's what this case actually is at its core. It's a story where the missing person came home and the homecoming made everything worse. It's a story where DNA solved a crime and created a deeper mystery at the same time. Mary Day was not murdered. The cadaver dogs were wrong, or the shoe belonged to someone else, or the scent was some other tragedy buried in that backyard. William Hoole was a monster, but he wasn't a killer, not in this case. But what happened to Mary during those 22 years? What did she endure? Who hurt her? Where did she live? Why couldn't she remember the word Mohawk, the word that was supposed to be her lifeline? Nobody knows, including Mary. She was found alive. She was scientifically confirmed. She hugged her mother. She stood in front of her sisters. And still, in some deep and unfixable way, she never really came home. The girl who walked out of that house in Seaside in July of 1981 left something behind that DNA couldn't retrieve. Sometimes, the scariest disappearances aren't the ones where the person is never found. They're the ones where the person comes back, and you realize that the thing you were mourning wasn't the body. It was everything inside it, and that part, the part that mattered, is still out there. Somewhere in those 22 years, Mary Day got lost. And even after she was found, she never really got back. The case is officially closed. The woman was real. The match was clean. But ask her sisters what they think. And the honest answer is the same thing Kathy said the first day she saw her. That is not Mary. And they may have been more right than anyone wanted to admit. Picture this, a courtroom in Brisbane, Australia. April 2003. A man sits in the defendant's chair. He's a known serial predator. He's already confessed to killing 4 women, and today he's on trial for the murder of a 5th, a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Natasha Ryan. Her family is there. They've grieved for nearly 5 years. They've released balloons on her birthday. They've made peace, as much as anyone can, with the fact that a monster took their little girl. And then, mid-trial, the prosecutor stands up and drops a bombshell that shatters the entire room. The victim is not dead. In fact, she's in police custody right now. Alive. Well. And she's been hiding in a cupboard 4 kilometers from her mother's house for 4 years and 8 months. Let that sink in for a second. Because this is one of the strangest missing persons cases ever recorded, and it raises questions that, even 20 years later, nobody can really answer. Let me set the scene for you. It's August 31st, 1998. The last day of winter in Rockhampton, Queensland, a regional city in Central Australia. The weather is mild, about 25 degrees Celsius, warm enough to make you forget the season is changing. It's broad daylight. It's a Monday. Kids are going to school. But here's the thing. Rockhampton is not a calm town right now, not even close, because there's a predator in the area. His name is Leonard Fraser, and locals have already nicknamed him the Rockhampton Rapist. 3 women have vanished in recent months: Beverly Lego, Sylvia Benedetti, Julie Turner. All gone. No bodies, no closure. Just whispers and fear and the terrible feeling that someone is hunting in your backyard. So the vibe on the morning of August 31st is tense. Mothers are walking their kids to school. Parents are double-checking locks at night. And into this atmosphere walks 14-year-old Natasha Ryan. Now, Natasha, everyone called her Grasshopper, was, by all accounts, a kid going through a rough patch. Her parents had recently divorced. She'd been experimenting with drugs. She'd attempted suicide. She'd even faked a pregnancy at one point. She was the kind of teenager who, on paper, fits every single box of what investigators call a high-risk missing person, a flight risk, a runaway profile. But she was also kind. She'd spent Christmas Day visiting the sick and the elderly. She'd been a bridesmaid in her stepmother's wedding, trying to hold her fractured family together. She was complicated. She was 14. She was loved. And on that Monday morning, her mother dropped her off at school. A completely mundane moment, the last one anyone would have with her for almost 5 years. Natasha never came home. She didn't come home that night. She didn't come home that week. She didn't come home that year. A massive search kicked off almost immediately. State emergency services, local police, volunteers combing bushland, helicopters overhead, and they found nothing. No clothes, no witnesses, no trail, nothing. Now, in any other town, police might have leaned into the runaway theory. She had a history. She'd disappeared before. But this wasn't any other town. This was Rockhampton in 1998, and there was a serial killer actively operating within the city limits. So the investigation pivoted, and pivoted hard toward Leonard Fraser. And then something remarkable happened. Fraser started talking. While locked up for other crimes, he confessed to police informants in recorded conversations that he had murdered Natasha Ryan. He gave details. He built a narrative. He slotted Natasha neatly into the list of women he'd killed. For the Ryan family, this was the end. There was no body, no, but there was a killer, and he'd confessed. So they did what families do when they've run out of hope. They mourned. On Natasha's 17th birthday, 70 friends and family members gathered and released balloons into the Queensland sky. A girl they loved was dead. They accepted it. They moved on, as much as anyone can. Now, flash forward. It's April 2003, almost 5 years later. Leonard Fraser is sitting in the Supreme Court in Brisbane on trial for the murder of Natasha Ryan and several other women. The prosecution is presenting its case. The defense is doing its job. The family is sitting in that courtroom, reliving the worst moment of their lives. And then, on April 11th, 2003, everything changes. Police receive an anonymous tip, a letter. It tells them to look at a house, a specific house in Rockhampton belonging to a 26-year-old man named Scott Black. Scott was Natasha's boyfriend. He had been actually at the time she disappeared. He'd been questioned back then. Nothing came of it. But now in the middle of a murder trial, police raid his house. They search it, and in a small, cramped, dark cupboard, they find her. Natasha Ryan, 19 years old, alive, breathing, hiding, mid-trial. The prosecutor, Paul Rutledge, stands up in front of the judge, the jury, the accused serial killer, and Natasha's shattered family, and announces that the murder victim is currently alive and in police custody. Imagine that moment. Imagine being her mother. Okay, let's stop right here, because this is where the story stops being a missing persons case and becomes something much, much stranger. A psychological puzzle that nobody has fully cracked. Let's talk about the cupboard first. Natasha had been hiding in Scott Black's house for 4 years and 8 months. And when I say hiding, I mean hiding. She had a designated cupboard, a small cramped space where she would silently squeeze herself whenever anyone knocked on the door. A repairman, a neighbor, a friend of Scott's, anyone. She'd slip into that cupboard and sit in the dark, silent, invisible. Now, think about that for a second. In nearly 5 years, she left the house a grand total of 6 times. 6, and always at night. One of those outings was a midnight trip to the beach. That was her big adventure in half a decade. She didn't buy her own groceries. She couldn't be seen. She was so paranoid about Scott buying items that might raise suspicions about a woman living with him that she literally made her own sanitary pads by cutting up bath towels. That's the level of discipline. That's the level of paranoia. How does a person do that? How does a teenager, someone whose entire biology is wired for social connection, for rebellion, for identity formation, sit in a dark cupboard for 5 years and not lose her mind? Because that's not running away. That's not starting a new life. That's burying yourself alive in a house 4 kilometers from your own mother. 4 kilometers, roughly 2.5 miles. That's the distance from her mother's home. She could have walked there in under an hour. Now let's talk about the grief, because this is the part that really messes with you. Her family held a memorial. 70 people showed up. Her mother was wrecked. The whole town was mourning a dead schoolgirl who had been murdered by a serial killer. And Natasha knew. She knew it was happening. She was reading the news. She was watching the coverage. She was sitting behind closed blinds in Scott Black's house, surfing the internet, and watching her own mother grieve her to death. How do you mentally justify that? How do you let your own mother break in half when you could end it all with a single phone call? And she later said, and this is important, that she felt the lie had grown too big. That by the time she realized how much pain she'd caused, stopping it felt impossible. She said she felt she deserved to be punished for what she'd done to her family. So she just kept going. Day after day, year after year. In the dark. That's not a runaway story. That's a psychological cage, built brick by brick out of shame and guilt and trauma bonding until the walls were thicker than any cupboard door. But the biggest glitch in this entire story, and I mean this, is Leonard Fraser. Why did he confess? Think about this. Fraser was a real serial killer. He had killed real women. Beverly Lego, Sylvia Benedetti, Julie Turner. Those murders were real. Those confessions were true. So why, in the middle of all that, did he falsely confess to murdering Natasha Ryan, a girl he had never met, had never touched, had never harmed in any way? Everything we think we know about criminal interrogations suggests that serial killers sometimes inflate their numbers for notoriety. They want to be feared. They want the body count. But to confess to a specific victim with specific details for a murder that literally never happened, that's a forensic earthquake. It means the entire infrastructure of the case, the investigation, the indictment, the trial, was built on a lie that came from the mouth of a confirmed killer. How do you trust a confession again after that? How do you trust anything? So what happened after the cupboard door opened? Natasha and Scott faced the legal fallout. They were fined for their roles in the false investigation. The public was furious. The taxpayer, money, the wasted police resources, the grief, all of it for a lie. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Natasha and Scott stayed together. They sold their story to the media for a reported $120,000. They later sold their wedding story for another $200,000. They got married in 2008. They had 4 children. Natasha trained as a nurse, working quietly under the name Tosh Black, trying to build something normal out of the wreckage. Leonard Fraser? He was still convicted of the other murders, the real ones. He died in prison in 2007. But he was, of course, acquitted of killing Natasha Ryan. Because Natasha Ryan walked into the courtroom and testified at her own murder trial as the victim who wasn't. Let that land for a second. She was the star witness for the prosecution at a trial where the charge was her own death. And in a final, gutting footnote, on June 2, 2024, at the age of 40, Natasha Ryan was found dead on a Rockhampton golf course. Police said the death was non-suspicious, No foul play. She left behind 4 children and a story that still refuses to make sense. So here's what we're left with. A girl who didn't die, but chose to disappear. A killer who confessed to a murder he didn't commit. A family that grieved for a daughter who could hear them grieving. And a dark cupboard 4 kilometers from home where a teenager sat in silence for almost 5 years because she couldn't figure out how to come back. She didn't die in 1998. She just stopped existing. And when she finally stepped back into the light, it was in the middle of a courtroom. 5 years late, with a serial killer in the dock and her own mother watching from the gallery. Some disappearances end with a body. Some end with a question. This one ended with a girl walking out of a cupboard and saying, "I was here the whole time." And honestly, that might be the eeriest ending of all. Picture a 2-story house in a working-class neighborhood. Parents live on the first floor. They watch television at night. They make coffee in the morning. They have grandkids who visit. And for 10 years, directly above their heads, in a bedroom on the second floor, a kidnapped teenager is living in total silence, using a metal bucket for a toilet because she can't risk being heard flushing, sneaking down to the basement in the dead of night for quick showers, watching morning talk shows on a tiny television to remind herself that human beings exist. The man hiding her? The security guard from her middle school. This is the case of Tanya Kach, and it's a story about how the most dangerous predators don't lurk in alleys or parking lots. They wear uniforms, they carry badges, and they operate in the exact places we send our children to be safe. Let me take you to McKeesport, Pennsylvania. February 1996, a post-industrial Rust Belt town outside of Pittsburgh. This is a place that's been struggling for decades. The mills are gone, the jobs have thinned out, and the mood around town is muted. The kind of community where people mind their own business because they've got enough problems of their own. The region had just been hammered by the blizzard of '96, one of the historic snowstorms of the decade. Massive drifts, paralyzed roads, the whole thing. By February 10th, things were thawing. Temperatures in the 30s, rising toward 60. Damp, melting snow, gray skies. The atmosphere was bleak and quiet, the perfect backdrop for a teenager to slip through the cracks without anyone raising an immediate alarm. And Tanya Kach was 14 years old, an 8th grader at Cornell Middle School, and she fit, tragically, the exact profile predators look for. Her home life was turbulent, her parents were divorced, she was emotionally starving, hungry for attention, affection, any kind of validation. She was skipping school. She was acting out. She was, in every sense, a kid sending up distress signals, looking for someone to care about her. And that's when Thomas Hose entered her life. Hose was a 38-year-old security guard at Cornell Middle School, the literal person hired to keep children safe. And over a period of about 4 months, he systematically groomed Tanya using the classic predatory playbook, the one that unfortunately works every time. He paid special attention to her. He gave her money for cigarettes. He bought her jewelry. When she got in trouble for skipping classes, he covered for her. He made her feel seen. He made her feel protected. He made her feel special. To a 14-year-old girl drowning in a chaotic home life, an adult who shields you from consequences feels like a sanctuary. It wasn't. It was a trap 4 months in the making. On February 10th, 1996, Tanya Kach walks out of her father's house and disappears. Police treat her like a standard runaway, and on paper, she fits the profile. Troubled teenager, truancy issues, rebellious behavior, divorced home. Cases like hers don't get massive search efforts. They get filed, they get monitored, they get waited out because most runaways come home. Tanya doesn't come home, and the reason is that she hadn't run far at all. She had walked straight to Thomas Hose's house, where he had convinced her she could live freely, safely, away from her parents. She thought she was escaping to a better life. She was 14. She trusted him. He was, after all, the school security guard. What she walked into was a prison. And here's the twist that makes this case almost unbelievable. Jose didn't live alone. He lived in that house with his elderly parents. His parents lived downstairs. His grown son also lived in the house at various points. For the first 4 years, Tanya was locked entirely inside Jose's second-floor bedroom, forbidden to look out the windows, forbidden to make sound, forbidden to flush the toilet. She used a metal bucket as a bathroom. The only way she was allowed to shower was to sneak downstairs in the middle of the night, silently, while the rest of the house slept and washed quickly in the basement. And for 4 years. To keep her sane, she watched morning talk shows. Live with Regis and Kelly became her anchor to reality. The laughter of strangers on a television screen was her only connection to the world outside the bedroom walls. By the year 2000, Jose altered his strategy. He created a fake identity for Tanya, Nikki Allen. He introduced her to his own parents, after 4 years of her living silently above them, as his adult girlfriend. Somehow, unbelievably, they accepted this. They accepted a young woman emerging from their son's bedroom under a fake name and asked no real questions. Tanya, as Nikki, was now allowed limited, heavily monitored excursions outside, strict curfews, closely watched, but the physical captivity had loosened. By 2006, 10 years after she disappeared, Tanya had defied Jose's rules by secretly getting a part-time job at a local convenience store, JJ's Deli Mart, still working under the fake name Nikki Allen. She started getting to know the owner, Joe Sparico, and his family. And something in her cracked. She watched Joe interact with his wife and kids, normal, loving, functional, and she realized, maybe for the first time in a decade, that her own reality was not normal. On March 21st, 2006, she broke down. She told Joe the truth. Her name was Tanya Kach. She had been a missing person for 10 years. The man she lived with had taken her when she was 14. Joe called the police that evening. Officers raided Jose's house. Tanya was free. Okay, let's actually sit with the logistics of this case, because there are questions here that nobody has fully answered. Start with the parents. Thomas Jose's parents lived in that house for 10 years, directly below a bedroom where a captive teenager was being kept silent, hidden, and invisible. How does that happen? How does a human being live on the second floor of a house for 4 years without the people on the first floor noticing? Tanya breathed. She coughed. She ate. She used a bucket. She needed water. She needed food. She needed to move around. Every single one of those activities creates sound, creates waste, creates evidence. How did Jose's parents not hear footsteps that didn't belong to their son? Not notice extra food disappearing from the kitchen? Not smell anything? Not catch a glimpse through a doorway? For 4 years, we're supposed to believe they had no idea a second person was living above them. And then, in 2000, a girlfriend named Nikki appears. A young woman the parents had never been introduced to, emerging from their son's bedroom, and they just accepted it. Asked no questions. Did not recognize her from the local news coverage of a missing McKeesport teenager from their own community. Did not find anything strange about her never leaving the house without Thomas's permission, never meeting friends, never having a life of her own. Either those parents were genuinely, impossibly oblivious, or they saw exactly what was happening and chose not to see it. And both answers are disturbing in their own way. Now the other question everyone asks, why didn't Tanya climb out the window? Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she run the first time he let her go to a store? And this is where you have to understand grooming, really understand it, because the physical door of the bedroom was not the lock that held her. The lock was inside her head. Thomas Jose spent years convincing Tanya that the outside world was dangerous to her. He told her the police were hunting her. He told her her parents didn't want her anymore, had disowned her for running away. He told her he was the only person standing between her and some catastrophic punishment. He isolated her from every form of reality checking. When you're 14 and someone you trust tells you, the whole world is against you and I'm the only one keeping you safe, that belief hardens into concrete. It doesn't matter if it's false. By the time you're 15, 16, 17, that belief is your reality. Running becomes more terrifying than staying. The imagined danger outside becomes worse than the actual danger inside. That's grooming. That's how a bedroom becomes a prison without needing a single chain. And then there's the final, most infuriating piece. Thomas Jose was the school security guard. Let's say that one more time, slowly. The person hired by the school system, tasked specifically with keeping middle school children safe, used that position of authority to identify a vulnerable 14-year-old, groom her for 4 months, and abduct her. He didn't need to hide in a van. He didn't need to lurk in a park. He walked the school hallways. He had a uniform. He had institutional trust. He had access to children's schedules, to their family situations, to their emotional vulnerabilities. He used the machinery of child safety against the exact child it was built to protect. How many warning signs got missed? How many teachers saw the relationship and assumed nothing because he's just being nice? How many times did the system's own gatekeeper breeze through the safeguards because he was the safeguard? Thomas Hose was convicted and sentenced to a maximum of 15 years in prison. He was released in 2022. Tanya Kach tried to rebuild. She reclaimed her life. She wrote a New York Times best-selling book, Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, telling her story in her own voice. She worked to rebuild her relationship with her father after years of painful estrangement. But the legal system continued to fail her in stunning ways. She filed civil suits against the school district, the police, Darren the security company, institutions that had failed to protect her from a predator operating right inside her middle school. A federal appeals court dismissed her lawsuits, ruling that she had waited too long to file. The court essentially decided that a victim of extreme brainwashing should have been able to identify her injuries and file legal paperwork while the brainwashing was still intact. It's a ruling that makes your blood pressure rise because it assumes that trauma operates on a convenient legal timeline. It doesn't. Anyone who has ever survived psychological abuse can tell you that. And her family, tragically, fractured further. Her father and stepmother, before their eventual reconciliation, partly blamed her for running away. As though a 14-year-old groomed by a 38-year-old authority figure had made an adult choice. But the real takeaway from the Tanya Kach case isn't the prison sentence or the failed lawsuits or even the 10 years she lost. It's the shape of the predator. He wasn't hiding in the woods. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wasn't a stranger. He was the man at the front door of the school, the man parents trusted, the man every institution had vetted and approved and placed there specifically to keep children safe. He hid a kidnapped teenager in a bedroom above his own parents for 10 years. In a crowded neighborhood, in a small town, right under the nose of the system that should have caught him. The monsters were warned about as kids wear dark clothes and drive vans. The monsters that actually take children tend to wear something much scarier, uniforms. And the scariest part of Tanya Kach's story isn't the bedroom or the bucket, or even the 10 lost years. It's that the hand that closed the door on her for the first time had a badge on its sleeve. Picture a frozen lake, February in Michigan. Wind so cold it burns your face. Snow drifted up in waves, the surface glittering under a gray, unforgiving sky. A set of footprints leads out from the shore, across the ice, straight and purposeful. And then, about 200 yards out, they just stop. No broken ice, no hole where a body fell through, no second set of tracks turning around and heading back, no struggle, no blood, nothing. Just the end of the prints and the endless white of the lake beyond. 15 months later, a 23-year-old college student wakes up in a sunny meadow in Massachusetts, 700 miles away, wearing clothes he's never seen before, carrying a backpack that isn't his, and with absolutely no memory of how he got there. This is the story of Stephen Kubaki, and it is one of the strangest disappearances in American history. Let me take you to February 1978, Saugatuck, Michigan, the western edge of the state, right where the land gives way to the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. And here's the thing, this isn't just any stretch of coastline. This is inside what locals call the Lake Michigan Triangle. Yeah, like the Bermuda Triangle, but with ice and pine trees instead of warm water. For decades, this region has carried a strange reputation. Ships have vanished here, planes have gone down without explanation. Captains have disappeared from the decks of their own boats mid-voyage, never to be seen again. The lore is thick. People in these lakeside towns don't joke about it. They just shrug and say, yeah, stuff happens out there. So already the atmosphere is loaded. It's February. The lake is frozen but treacherous. The winds off the water are biting. Heavy snow blankets the shore and the ice, creating this blinding, silent expanse where sound gets swallowed and distance plays tricks on your eyes. It's beautiful, and it's absolutely unforgiving. Into this setting walks Stephen Kubaki. He's 23 years old, a senior at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He's majoring in history with a focus on the German language. He's 1 semester and 9 credits away from graduating. And Stephen is not some clueless kid wandering into the wilderness. He's a free spirit, sure. He once organized a one-man protest to protect library books. He'd spent a year studying abroad in Europe, but he's experienced outdoors. He's a capable cross-country skier. He knows this lake, he knows winter, he's prepared. On the day he vanishes, his roommate Mark watches him pack his backpack. Winter gear, supplies, or routine stuff. They say goodbye. Stephen walks out the door into the cold, heading for a solo ski trip along the frozen shoreline. A totally normal afternoon. The kind of thing Stephen had done dozens of times, and that's the last anybody sees of him for over a year. When Stephen doesn't come home that night, nobody panics. He's an experienced outdoorsman. Maybe he camped, maybe he got delayed. But by day 2, day 3, day 4, the silence starts to feel wrong. By the end of the week, 7 full days, his roommate calls the police. The search begins, and what they find is, honestly, one of the strangest crime scenes you'll ever hear described. On February 20th, 1978, snowmobilers moving along the frozen shore near Saugatuck spot a pile of abandoned gear on the ice. It's Stephen's equipment, his skis, his poles, his backpack, just sitting there on the snow. Here's the first thing that doesn't add up. His backpack is found in one location, but his footprints, his actual boot tracks in the fresh snow, lead from a different spot. They come off a ridge. They move out onto the frozen lake, roughly 200 yards from shore, and then they end. Just end. Let me be very specific about what I mean. There is no broken ice where the footprints terminate, no hole where a man punched through and went into the water. There's no blood, no sign of a struggle, no sign of an animal, and crucially, there are no return tracks, no second set of footprints walking back toward the shore, no prints veering off in another direction. The man who made those footprints walked 200 yards out onto the ice, and then he was gone. Local authorities do what they have to do. They search the area. They comb the lake. They find nothing. By May of 1978, the case is officially closed. The presumption is tragic, but simple. Stephen Kubaki fell through a thin patch of ice, got pulled under, and drowned. Hope College awards him his bachelor's degree in absentia. His family begins the long, slow process of grieving. And that, everyone assumes, is the end of the story. Except it isn't. Because 15 months later, specifically May 5th, 1979, Stephen Kubaki wakes up. He's in a grassy meadow. The sun is shining, the air's warm. It's spring. He sits up and looks around and has absolutely no idea where he is. He's not in Michigan. He's not on the lake. He's not anywhere near where he vanished. He's in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, over 700 miles east of the frozen shoreline where his footprints stopped. And it gets weirder. He looks down at himself, and he's wearing clothes he doesn't recognize. Not his clothes. Unfamiliar fabric, unfamiliar fit. He's wearing brand new prescription glasses, and they're not his prescription. He has no idea where they came from or why they're on his face. Next to him is a backpack, also not his. He opens it. Inside he finds maps covered in handwritten notes and markings he doesn't remember making. He finds homemade hitchhiking signs, about $40 in cash, and a Wisconsin Marathon t-shirt. He has no memory of any of this, none. The last thing he remembers, as far as he knows, is skiing in Michigan in February of 1978. He walks into the nearest town, disoriented, trying to piece together what's happened. He stops at a newsstand. He picks up a local newspaper. He looks at the date. May 1979. 15 months gone. Okay, let's stop and actually dismantle this scene, piece by piece. Because none of it works. Start with the footprints, just the footprints. If Stephen fell through the ice, there would be a hole. Ice doesn't self-seal in February. Frozen lake water doesn't just close up behind someone like curtains. If the ice was thin enough to break under his weight, the rescuers would have found the break point. They didn't. The ice was solid where the tracks ended. If he turned around and walked back, for any reason, there would be a second set of footprints heading toward shore. There wasn't. If he got lifted or carried by another person, there would be drag marks, extra prints, disturbed snow. There wasn't. The footprints just stopped, mid-lake, mid-stride, as if the man walking had been plucked out of existence. And here's the other thing that bugs me. His skis, poles, and backpack weren't found at the end of the footprints. His gear was in a different location entirely, so either he walked out onto the ice without his gear and then vanished, or somebody, or something, rearranged the physical evidence. Either way, the logical sequence of how a human being moves through space just breaks. Now, let's talk about the 700 miles. 15 months is a long time. And in that window, Stephen Kubaki, or some version of him, traveled from Michigan to Massachusetts. He acquired new clothes, new prescription glasses, which means at some point, someone, somewhere, examined his eyes and wrote him a prescription. He had maps with his own handwriting on them. He had a Wisconsin Marathon t-shirt, which means at some point he was in Wisconsin. He had hitchhiking signs, which means he was moving between states, interacting with drivers, with strangers, with truck stops. If he was in a complete fugue state, if he genuinely didn't know who he was, how did he function? How did he buy food? How did he not get picked up by police for acting strangely? How did he not end up in a psychiatric hospital where his fingerprints or his face would have pinged a missing persons database? Somehow, for 15 months, a man with no memory of himself navigated American society seamlessly enough to not trigger a single alarm. That's not easy. That's not normal. That's somebody operating at a functional level that doesn't match total amnesia. Which brings us to the amnesia itself. Psychogenic amnesia is a real documented medical condition. It's rare, but it exists. Severe psychological trauma can cause the brain to essentially firewall off memories and identity as a protective measure. That's established science. But 15 months? 15 months of a secondary existence during which Stephen presumably had a name, a routine, relationships, patterns of behavior, and then on a random Tuesday in a random Massachusetts meadow, the Stephen Kubaki operating system just reboots, and the 15 months of alternate life data get erased clean? That's not how fugue states typically work. Most psychogenic amnesia cases last days or weeks, not over a year. And when they resolve, patients usually have at least some fragmented memories of the missing period. Flashes, impressions, something. Stephen had almost nothing, just vague sensations. Being cold, being alone in the dark, a creeping fear of freezing to death. That's it. So what happened to Stephen Kubaki? For over 4 decades, he refused to say much. He finished his degree. He moved to the Pacific Northwest. He became, and I love this part, a clinical psychologist, the man who experienced one of the strangest documented psychological events in American history, built a quiet, successful career, helping other people sort through their minds. And for 40+ years, he maintained the same answer. I don't remember. I don't know what happened. I was gone. And then I was back. But then in 2023, ahead of a memoir, Stephen broke his silence. He claimed the memories had finally started returning. And his explanation, his own explanation for what it's worth, was that his missing time wasn't paranormal at all. He said he had suffered a kind of ideological and psychological break in the turbulent late 1970s. He said he became what he called an idealistic terrorist in training. He claimed he'd associated with an unnamed revolutionary organization, experimented with hallucinogenic drugs, had spiritual experiences involving alternate realities, and even tried to join the French Foreign Legion overseas. Whether that story fully holds up is a whole separate question. It explains the travel. It explains the new identity. It doesn't entirely explain the footprints that ended in the middle of a frozen lake without a second set going back. And that's what makes this case sit in such a strange category. Because it's not fully paranormal. There's no little green men, no beam of light, no portal. But it's also not fully explained by medical science. The physical evidence at the lake doesn't fit a standard disappearance. The duration of the amnesia doesn't fit a standard fugue. Even Stephen's own explanation only covers part of what happened. He is a man who stepped off the map in February 1978 and popped back into existence 15 months later in a meadow 700 miles away. His footprints literally stopped in the snow. His mind literally stopped recording for over a year. And somewhere in that missing window, he became someone else, someone he eventually stopped being. The Lake Michigan Triangle has a lot of stories: ships that vanished, planes that disappeared, people who walked onto ice and never came home. Stephen Kubaki is the only one we know of who came back. And the question he left behind, the question nobody, not even Stephen himself, has fully answered, is still sitting out there on the ice. What happens in the space where the footprints end? Imagine being handed a child. You've been grieving for over a year. You've accepted, against every instinct a mother has, that your newborn son is probably dead. And then the FBI knocks on your door with a toddler in their arms and says, "We found him. This is your boy." You look at the child. Something feels off. But the federal government, the most powerful investigative agency on Earth, is telling you to stop doubting. So you take him home. You raise him, you love him, you name him Paul. And then, 50 years later, a little plastic tube of saliva tells you the truth. The boy you raised was a stranger. And your real son. Nobody knows where he went. Not in 1964, not today, maybe never. This is one of the most baffling kidnapping cases in American history, and it isn't one mystery, it's two, stacked on top of each other, the colliding in the worst possible way. Let me take you back to April 1964. Chicago, Illinois. Michael Reese Hospital. This is mid-century America. Kennedy has been dead for 5 months. The Beatles just played Ed Sullivan. People are still leaving their front doors unlocked, and hospital security? It basically doesn't exist. If you walked into a maternity ward wearing a white uniform and a confident expression, nobody stopped you. Nobody asked for a badge. Nobody checked a clipboard. Authority was assumed, not verified. In room after room, new mothers are recovering. Among them is Dora Fronzac. She's 28 years old. Her husband Chester is 33. They've just had their first successful pregnancy after losing a stillborn child the year before. Think about what that means. They've already buried one baby, and now, finally, they have a healthy son. Born April 25th, 1964. They name him Paul Joseph Fronzac. By every medical note, he's perfect. A 99% perfect baby, as authorities would later describe him. No birthmarks, no scars, no distinguishing features other than his ear shape and his blood type. Just a clean, healthy, beautiful newborn boy. On the morning of April 27th, Dora is sitting up in bed, feeding her one-day-old son. The room is calm. The hospital's humming along in its sterile, trustworthy rhythm. And then a woman walks in. She's wearing a nurse's uniform. She looks like she belongs there. She smiles and says the pediatrician needs to examine the baby. Dora hands her son over. That woman walks out of the room, down the hall, out of the hospital, and into the streets of Chicago. And nobody ever sees baby Paul Fronzac again. The investigation that follows is massive. The FBI gets involved. It becomes one of the most high-profile kidnapping cases in American history at the time. They interview every staff member. They circulate photos. They hunt. And they find nothing. No fake nurse, no baby, no trail, just a grieving family and a cold case getting colder by the day. Now, jump forward over a year. July 1965, Newark, New Jersey. Hundreds of miles east of Chicago, a male toddler is found abandoned outside a busy department store. Just sitting in a pushchair. Alone. No parents, no note, no identification, nothing. The child is placed in foster care under the name Scott McKinley, and he might have just slipped quietly through the system. Another anonymous abandoned kid. But the FBI is still desperately hunting for a missing baby, and a suspicious, unclaimed boy of roughly the right age has just appeared on their radar. So they do something that, in hindsight, is almost unbelievable. They compare the ears. That's right. In 1966, the FBI concludes that they cannot rule out that this New Jersey toddler is the missing Chicago baby, based largely on analysis of his ear shape compared to the blurry hospital photos of day-old Paul Fronzac. And that's enough. The bar is met. The case gets a resolution. The Fronzacs, exhausted, broken, desperate, are told the miracle they've prayed for has happened. Their son has been found. They adopt him. They take him home. They raise him as Paul Joseph Fronzac. And for decades, that's the story. A kidnapping with a happy ending. Case closed. Except it isn't. Because the man raised as Paul grows up feeling like a ghost in his own family. He never quite clicks. He doesn't look like his parents. He doesn't move like them. He has this persistent, aching sense that something is wrong with the picture. At one point, as a child rummaging through a crawl space looking for Christmas presents, he finds boxes of old newspaper clippings about the kidnapping. His mother confirms the story. Yes, you were kidnapped. Yes, you were found. And then tells him bluntly to never speak of it again. He carries that weight into adulthood. And finally, in 2012, he does what millions of curious Americans were just starting to do at that point. He spits in a tube, he sends it off, and he waits. The results come back, and they detonate his life. He is not related to Dora Fronzac. He is not related to Chester Fronzac. He has zero biological connection to the people who raised him. The FBI got it wrong. Completely, absolutely, catastrophically wrong. He isn't Paul. He never was. Okay, stop. Let's actually sit with how insane this is. Let's start with the ear test. DNA testing as we know it didn't exist yet in 1966. Fingerprinting a newborn is imprecise. So the FBI, presented with an unclaimed toddler and a missing baby, decided the way to definitively identify a kidnapping victim was to look at the shape of a 2-year-old's ears and compare them to hospital photographs of a 1-day-old. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a photo of a newborn next to a photo of that same kid 2 years later? They don't look the same. Their faces change. Their heads change. Their ears absolutely change. A newborn's cartilage is still forming. Everything shifts. Human beings grow. How do you close a federal kidnapping case on ear shape? You don't. Not really. You guess. That's what happened. The FBI made an educated guess, wrapped it in the credibility of a federal badge, and handed a random toddler to a grieving family like he was a lost suitcase being returned at baggage claim. And here's the second gut punch. Dora Fronzac reportedly had doubts. When she first saw the toddler, something felt wrong. A mother's instinct. That quiet voice that says, "This isn't mine." But imagine her position for a second. She's lost one baby already to stillbirth. She's lost a second to kidnapping. She is at the absolute bottom of what a human being can endure. And now, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country is standing in front of her, telling her the nightmare is over, telling her to stop grieving, and telling her she can be a mother again. Who, in that moment, has the strength to say, "I don't think that's my son"? Because the second she says those words, the hope vanishes. The miracle ends. She has to go back to mourning. She has to climb back into that pit, and the FBI, the experts, the professionals, the ones who know, are telling her she's wrong. So she swallows the doubt. She takes the child home. She loves him. She raises him, and she spends the rest of her life trying to silence the voice that told her the truth from the very first moment. That is not just a failure of forensic science. That is psychological warfare waged on a grieving mother by the system that was supposed to protect her. But now we get to the biggest glitch in this entire story. The question that once you see it, you can't unsee it. If the man raised as Paul Fronzac isn't Paul, then who is he? And more importantly, who abandoned him in a stroller in New Jersey in 1965? Genetic genealogy, years later, cracks part of it. The man raised as Paul is actually Jack Rosenthal. He was born in New Jersey. His biological parents were Gilbert and Marie Rosenthal, a deeply troubled couple. Gilbert was a veteran with PTSD. Marie was a severe alcoholic. Relatives would later describe horrifying scenes. Children kept in cribs in rooms reeking of urine. A black eye on toddler Jack. Reports that the kids were sometimes kept in a cage. And then there's Jack's twin sister, Jill Rosenthal. She also vanished in 1965. And unlike Jack, she has never been found. Her fate is still completely unknown. Presumed dead, presumed abandoned, presumed something. Nobody knows. So the best theory is this. Gilbert and Marie Rosenthal may have done something terrible to their twin daughter Jill. And to cover it up, or to erase the evidence, they abandoned her twin brother Jack outside a department store in Newark, where he was swept into foster care, misidentified as a kidnapped Chicago infant, and handed to the Fronzac family by an FBI more interested in closing a famous case than actually solving it. That's 2 kidnappings, 2 separate tragedies, hundreds of miles apart, tragically, grotesquely, bureaucratically fused together by an ear comparison. And in the middle of all of this, the real baby Paul Fronzac is still missing. In 2019, genetic genealogists, including the legendary C.C. Moore, finally cracked the second half of the mystery. They locate the real Paul Fronzac. His name is Kevin Ray Beatty. He's living in rural Michigan. He'd been raised by a woman named Lorraine Fountain, who had dated a Chicago physician back in 1964, moved to Arkansas for a year, and mysteriously returned with a newborn baby. The identity of the actual woman in the nurse's uniform, still unknown. Her connection to Fountain, still unproven, still a shadow. Kevin Beatty, the real Paul Fronzac, spoke to his biological mother Dora on the phone a few times, 55 years after she handed him to a stranger, 55 years after she buried him in her heart. They never met in person. Kevin was dying of cancer. In November 2020, on his 56th birthday, he passed away. The mother who lost her son in a Chicago hospital in 1964 got to hear his voice a few times before he was gone for good. And Jack Rosenthal, the man who was raised as Paul, is still out there, still searching for his twin sister Jill, still carrying the psychological weight of 2 stolen lives. So think about what actually happened here. In 1964, a woman in a fake nurse's uniform walked out of a hospital with a baby and disappeared so completely that 60 years later, we still don't know who she was. A year later, an abused toddler was dumped in New Jersey by parents who may have killed his twin. And a desperate FBI glued these 2 tragedies together with an ear comparison and called it a win. 3 children, 2 mysteries, 1 family permanently fractured, and 1 haunting final question that's still sitting there, unanswered, right where it was left in April of 1964. What happened to baby Paul? Someone out there knows. Someone walked out of that hospital with him, and somewhere, in a life he may or may not even know is fake, the real Paul Fronzac may still be alive, living a stolen life under a stolen name, never knowing he was the center of one of the strangest kidnapping cases this country has ever seen. The case isn't closed. It was never closed. It was just misfiled. Imagine grieving your father for 5 years. Imagine the phone call. Imagine your mother's tears. Imagine the coroner's verdict, the life insurance payout, the slow, terrible process of accepting that your dad paddled out into the North Sea one March evening and never came home. Now imagine, 5 years later, turning on the news and seeing his face, alive, tanned, smiling in a photograph taken in Panama, standing next to your mother, who had been playing the role of a devastated widow the entire time you were breaking your own heart mourning him. This is the case of John Darwin, the canoe man. And it's not a story about a monster in the woods. It's something almost worse. It's the story of a husband and wife who decided their financial problems were worth more than their own children's grief. Let me take you to Seaton Carew, a small coastal town in County Durham in the northeast of England. It sits facing the North Sea, and if you've ever stood on that coast, you know what I mean when I say it's not a friendly body of water. The North Sea is cold, dark, and merciless. It's famous for volatile weather, sudden storms, and killing experienced sailors who thought they knew better. On the evening of Thursday, March 21, 2002, the atmosphere in Seaton, Karoo was deceptively calm. Dusk settling in. Barely a ripple on the water. The sea almost unnaturally still, the kind of tranquility that would later baffle Coast Guard search and rescue teams trying to figure out how an experienced kayaker could have drowned that night. That's the macro setting. Calm ocean, quiet coast, peaceful twilight. Now the personal setting, John Darwin, 51 years old. By outward appearances, a pretty unremarkable middle-class British guy. Former science and mathematics teacher. At the time, he was working as a prison officer at HM Prison Home House in Stockton. Stable job. Wife named Anne. 2 grown sons, Mark and Anthony. Underneath that respectable exterior, though, the Darwins were drowning. Not in the sea, in debt, crushing, unmanageable, bottomless debt. Alongside his job, John and Anne ran a rental property business, 12 bedsit properties, and they had massively over-leveraged themselves. In December 2000, they bought additional properties. The math stopped working. Bankruptcy proceedings were closing in. They were looking down the barrel of total financial collapse. That's the vibe heading into March 2002. A desperate, cornered couple, secretly panicking behind their ordinary British suburban facade. And on the evening of March 21st, John Darwin finished his night shift at the prison, drove home, called his wife, and said something chilling. This is it. He told Anne to pick him up later. He packed a rucksack with provisions, and he pushed his bright red kayak, the Orca, into the freezing North Sea. At roughly 4:30 p.m., John paddled out. According to the plan, Anne met him somewhere near North Gare, drove him to a railway station, and sent him off to the Lake District to hide. Then, Anne drove home and started her performance. At 9:30 p.m., she called the authorities and reported her husband missing. A massive search and rescue operation launched. 62 square miles of sea, searched by Coast Guards, helicopters, and rescue boats, was burning through thousands of pounds of taxpayer money. The next day, a double-ended paddle washed up on shore. Later, pieces of the shattered kayak were recovered. The narrative wrote itself. An experienced kayaker went out on a calm night, something terrible happened, and the North Sea claimed him. Tragic, sad, unsolved, but believable. In April 2003, a coroner issued an open verdict declaring John Darwin dead, which meant Anne could legally cash in the life insurance. She received £250,000. She used it to erase their £130,000 mortgage debt and restore financial stability. She wore black. She played the grieving widow flawlessly. And most importantly, she lied to her own sons. Mark and Anthony spent the next 5 years genuinely, painfully grieving a father who was very much alive. Because John Darwin hadn't fled the country. And he hadn't moved to a tropical island. He had done something so brazen and so logistically insane that it defies belief. He moved in next door. The Darwins owned multiple bedsit properties. John quietly moved into one of the units right next to his own family home on the cliff. He had a secret door built behind a wardrobe, connecting his hidden bedsit to the main house. During the day, he stayed hidden. At night, he would slip through the secret door and share a bed with his grieving widow wife. Over the years, he started venturing out using a fake identity. He stole the identity of a deceased infant named John Jones, who had been born in Sunderland and died in 1950, a classic intelligence community trick, looking up babies who died young and assuming their birth certificates. He used it to get a legitimate passport. And in 2006, John and Anne bought a tropical estate in Panama, planning their new life in the sun. Then, on December 1st, 2007, John Darwin walked into the West End Central Police Station in London, looked disheveled and confused, and told the officers, "I think I am a missing person." He claimed total amnesia, said he couldn't remember the last 5 years of his life, and 4 days later, on December 5th, the whole story blew apart spectacularly because of a single photograph and a simple Google search. All right, let's actually break this down, because the sheer audacity of what these two pulled off deserves scrutiny. Start with the secret room, If you fake your death, the logical next step is to disappear. Change your appearance, flee the country, cut all ties. That's basic fugitive logic. John Darwin did not do this. But John Darwin, a former teacher, a prison officer, a reasonably intelligent middle-class British man, decided the safest place to hide was the bedsit directly attached to his own house, accessed through a hidden door behind a wardrobe so he could sleep next to his grieving widow wife every single night. Think about the psychological horror of that setup for the people around him. His sons visited that house. They sat in the living room and mourned their dead father. And on the other side of a wall, sometimes only feet away, that father was hiding, listening, waiting for them to leave so he could come out and have dinner with their mother. How does a father do that? How do you hear your own son cry about your death and just keep hiding? How do you sit behind a wardrobe door, silent, while your children carry the weight of losing you? It's not just fraud, it's an emotional cruelty that's hard to fully process. And the logistics were wild. At one point, a tenant in the adjacent flats actually recognized John. He noticed John's distinctive limp and confronted him directly. "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" John's response. He said, "Don't tell anyone about this." And remarkably, the tenant didn't, which is its own strange commentary on human nature. Someone walks up to a dead man, confirms he's alive, and then just keeps it to himself. Now, let's talk about the amnesia claim, because this is where the whole thing becomes almost comically absurd. On December 1st, 2007, John Darwin walks into a London police station in the dead of the British winter. It's freezing outside. Gray, rainy, bone-cold December in England. And he tells our officers he has no memory of the last 5 years. But here's what he looked like. He had a deep tropical tan. He looked healthy, fit, rested, not like someone who had been through a traumatic head injury or a 5-year fugue state, like someone who had just stepped off a plane from Panama, which of course he had. Medical experts at the police station immediately noticed that his symptoms did not align with any documented form of trauma-induced amnesia. Real amnesia has specific patterns, specific neurological markers. John's story didn't match any of them because it wasn't amnesia, it was improvisation. And then came the digital footprint, the glitch, the stupidest, funniest, most satisfying crack in the entire 5-year scheme. When John and Anne were finalizing their relocation to Panama in 2006, they posed for a photograph, a cheerful, smiling photo with their Panamanian real estate agent documenting their new property. The real estate agent, doing what real estate agents do in the 2000s, posted that photo online. 5 years of elaborate fraud. A fake death, a fake identity, a hidden bedsit, a stolen deceased baby's birth certificate, hundreds of thousands of pounds in insurance money, 2 adult sons deceived, and the whole thing collapsed because a member of the public, suspicious of the amnesia story, went to their computer and typed 3 words into Google Images: John, Anne, Panama, and up popped a picture of the canoe man alive, tanned and grinning in Central America. That's it. That's how it ended. A suspicious citizen with an internet connection outperformed 5 years of criminal planning in about 30 seconds. The reason John tried the amnesia trick in the first place was actually pretty mundane. Panama had recently tightened its visa laws, requiring strict identity verification from the UK police. A background check on his fake identity, John Jones, the dead infant from 1950, would not hold up. He knew his cover was about to blow, so he improvised a return from the void story, thinking he could legitimize his return to the UK with an amnesia claim and quietly move on. It was the dumbest part of a remarkably dumb plan. The legal fallout was swift. Both John and Anne Darwin were convicted of extensive fraud and deception. Each received prison sentences exceeding 6 years. The stolen insurance money had to be returned. The reputations they had built over a lifetime were obliterated. But the worst part of this case isn't the fraud. Not really. It's the sons. Mark and Anthony Darwin spent 5 years genuinely grieving their father. 5 years believing he had died in a freezing ocean. 5 years of birthdays and holidays and family milestones haunted by the absence of a man they loved. And every day of those 5 years, their own mother had been lying to their faces, playing the widow, hugging them through their tears, knowing that behind a wardrobe door, their father was alive and well and complicit. Imagine finding that out. Imagine the phone call or the news report or whatever moment delivered that truth to them. Imagine sitting with that realization that your grief was theater to your own parents. The sons publicly cut ties with both parents. They chose to believe the story the evidence told, rather than the story their mother had spent 5 years selling them. And honestly, who could blame them? So here's the final shape of the Darwin case. John Darwin faked his death in the freezing North Sea to escape a pile of debt he and his wife had built themselves. He hid for 5 years behind a wardrobe in a bedsit attached to his own house, sleeping with his widow, listening to his sons mourn him through the walls. He used a dead baby's birth certificate to buy a tropical estate in Panama. And then he got caught because of a real estate agent's Instagram-era photograph. The monster in this story isn't lurking in the woods. The monster is sitting in a smiling photograph next to a tropical real estate agent, planning an early retirement paid for by his own family's grief. John Darwin paddled out into the North Sea to drown. But he didn't drown in the water. He drowned in a sea of his own ridiculous, greedy, meticulously planned lies. A sea that took 5 years to close over his head and was ultimately delivered to him by a Google search. Some disappearances are tragedies, some are mysteries, and some, like this one, are just elaborate frauds wearing a tragedy's costume. The canoe man didn't vanish. He hid. And when the hiding stopped working, he pretended to have forgotten the last 5 years of his own life, walked into a London police station with a tropical tan in the middle of a British winter, and hoped nobody would notice. Somebody noticed. Imagine sitting down across from your own mother. She's crying. She's reaching for your hand. She's telling you about your childhood, your first day of school, your father, your siblings, all the holidays and arguments and birthdays that made up the first 39 years of your life. And you feel absolutely nothing. Not recognition, not love, not even sadness for the stranger sobbing in front of you. Just the cold, quiet certainty that this person, however kind, is not your mother. Because you don't have a mother. Your life started 12 years ago in a shopping mall in Colorado, and everything before that is a black void you cannot access, no matter how hard anyone pushes you to remember. This is what happened to Jodie Roberts, and her story is one of the strangest, most disturbing disappearances in modern American history, not because someone took her, but because her own mind erased her. Let me take you to Tacoma, Washington, May 1985. A cool, damp, gray Pacific Northwest spring, the kind of weather where the sky feels like a low ceiling and the air smells like wet cedar. Temperatures in the high 40s, industrial waterfront, that specific brooding, moody atmosphere that only the coastal Pacific Northwest really has. And in the middle of this environment, working the crime beat at the Tacoma News-Tribune, is a reporter named Jodie Roberts. She's 27 years old at this point, though her story will end up spanning decades. She is tough. She is fearless. She is the kind of journalist who chases stories that scare other reporters away. This is the mid-1980s in the Pacific Northwest, and the region is sitting under the long shadow of the Green River Killer, a serial murderer who had been operating for years and would eventually be identified as Gary Ridgway. Jodie Roberts was reporting on exactly that kind of case. Corruption, missing persons, homicides, serial killers, the dark underbelly of her own region. Her colleagues described her as sharp, independent, hard-nosed, not the kind of person who scares easy, not the kind of person who crumbles. She solved mysteries for a living, which is what makes what happens to her so strange. In the days leading up to May 20th, 1985, Jodie Roberts starts acting a little off, out of character. She empties her bank accounts. She does something completely alien to her. She surrenders her beloved cats to the Humane Society. She seems to be preparing for something. A trip, maybe. Nobody's sure. On the morning of May 20th, 1985, she simply doesn't show up for a work assignment. Her car, a red Mazda Miata, is later found abandoned in a parking garage near the newspaper's headquarters. And because of Jodie's job, the police investigation kicks into a very specific gear. Because she wasn't just a random missing person, she was a reporter who exposed criminals for a living. She had been covering corrupt officials, she'd been writing about serial killers, she had enemies, she had people who might want her silenced. The working theory immediately becomes, someone took her. Someone killed her for a story. The case is eventually reclassified as a homicide investigation. Her family grieves, her colleagues grieve, the newsroom mourns one of their own, and that story holds for 12 years. But meanwhile, something bizarre is happening 1,200 miles away. Right around that same late May timeframe in 1985, a woman is found wandering aimlessly in a shopping mall in the Denver, Colorado area. She has no ID, she has no money, she has no idea who she is. She can't remember her own name, she can't remember where she was born, she can't remember anything. She's placed in a local hospital's psychiatric unit and given a temporary identity, essentially a Jane Doe. No one matches her to any missing persons report. No connection is made. She is, in every practical sense, a newborn adult, a fully grown woman with no past and no documentation. Eventually, she rebuilds. Under the name Jane D., she enrolls at the University of Denver. She puts herself through college working as a waitress. She even learns to speak Russian. In 1989, she moves to the remote fishing community of Sitka, Alaska, population around 8,500, about as far from Tacoma as you can get without leaving the United States. There, she meets a commercial fisherman named Dan Williams. She marries him. She gives birth to not one, but 2 sets of twin daughters. She becomes a mom of 4. She launches a successful internet web design business called Pongo Computer Works. She builds an entire life, happy, functional, anchored, full. And then, in the summer of 1997, a former co-worker of Jane Williams from a restaurant in Skagway, Alaska, sees a photograph on a cable news segment covering cold cases. The face on the screen matches a woman she used to work with. She picks up the phone and calls authorities. On July 15, 1997, King County Police Detective Tom Jensen contacts Jane Williams at her home in Sitka, and he tells her something that must have felt like the floor opening beneath her feet. Your name is Jodie Roberts. You were a reporter in Tacoma. You've been missing for 12 years. Your family has been mourning you. You're presumed dead. Okay, let's stop and actually work through this, because there are 2 huge logic problems sitting on top of this story, and they need to be unpacked. First problem, the bureaucratic nightmare. Amnesia is a real medical condition, fine. But we live in a bureaucratic society. Every legal adult activity requires paperwork, and paperwork requires identity. Think about what Jane D. managed to do without a verified past. She enrolled in a university. Universities usually require transcripts, a social security number, or a birth certificate for federal financial aid. She worked jobs. Employers need I-9 forms. She got married. Marriages require legal identification. She gave birth to 4 children in hospitals. Hospitals ask for insurance, names, histories. She paid taxes. She started a business. How does a person with no birth certificate and no verified identity do all of that legally in the United States for 12 years without anyone running a database check and saying, wait, who is this woman, actually? The answer is that the 1980s and 90s had bureaucratic cracks the size of canyons. People fell through them all the time. But still, 12 years of existing, marrying, raising kids, and building a business under a constructed identity is an extraordinary feat. It almost requires the system around her to have been looking the other way. Second problem, the irony of her being the victim. This is the part that really messes with me. Jodie Roberts was a high-profile journalist. Her face was in the paper. Her byline was public. When she went missing in 1985, it was news. Her colleagues at the News Tribune wrote about it. Law enforcement searched for her. She was on the radar. And a few weeks after she vanished, a woman with no identity walked into a Colorado hospital. That woman's face existed in the system. The Tacoma missing reporter's face existed in the system. Nobody for 12 years connected those 2 images. a journalist whose literal profession was to make people pay attention to missing persons. Stories became a missing person, and the machinery of attention she had mastered failed to find her. That's not just irony. That's a glitch in the entire infrastructure of how missing people get found. Now let's talk about the condition itself. What Jodie experienced is called dissociative fugue, or psychogenic amnesia. It's rare, really rare. It's when severe psychological trauma essentially pulls the plug on the brain's autobiographical memory system. The conscious self shuts off. A new identity sometimes takes its place. In most documented cases, fugue states last days, sometimes weeks, occasionally months. The memories eventually trickle back, at least partially. The person slowly reintegrates who they were with who they've become. But Jodie's memories never trickled back. Not after 12 years, not after being told her real name, not after being shown photographs of her family, not after talking to her own mother on the phone. Her brain essentially performed a complete hard drive wipe. 39 years of experiences, relationships, education, trauma, joy, and refused permanently to restore the backup. What triggered it? Nobody knows. Doctors speculated that she may have experienced a near-death event or a piece of trauma so extreme that her brain initiated the fugue as a protective mechanism, a kind of emergency evacuation from her own identity. Some wondered whether her investigative reporting had put her in physical danger that precipitated the break. Others thought it might have been something entirely internal, a spontaneous neurological event. The answer is locked inside her brain. And her brain isn't talking. The reunion between Jodie Roberts and her family in 1997 is one of the saddest things you'll read about in modern missing persons history. Imagine Jodie's mother. She had mourned her daughter for 12 years. She had likely accepted, somewhere deep inside, that her daughter had been murdered. And suddenly, she gets a phone call saying, "No, your daughter is alive. She's in Alaska. She has twins. Twice. She has a family." That's a miracle, right? That should be the happy ending. But when Jodie got on the phone with her mother, a woman she had grown up with, loved, shared holidays with, inherited her face from, she felt nothing. The 2-hour conversation passed like a conversation with a stranger. Her mother cried. Jodie felt confusion, maybe politeness, but no spark, no recognition, no emotional response, nothing. There was no click, no dam breaking, no memories returning. She was talking to a very kind woman on the phone who believed they shared a history, and Jodie couldn't access a single fragment of that history to meet her there. And here's what Jodie did next. She chose. She chose the life she had built over the life she had lost. She capitalized on the media frenzy, hired agents, sold her story to tabloid television, reportedly earned up to $100,000 from interviews. And she used that money not to reintegrate into Tacoma, but to retreat further into Alaska, into her husband, into her 4 daughters, into the woman she had become. She remained Jane Williams, not Jodie Roberts. Because the truth, the eerie, psychologically brutal truth, is that the Jodie Roberts who existed before May 20th, 1985, really did die that day. Her body survived, her brain kept working, but the person inside that body was gone. Whatever trauma flipped the switch, it replaced one human being with another, using the same flesh, and the new person had her own life to protect, her own children to raise, her own husband to love, her own Alaska to come home to. The family in Tacoma had lost a daughter. They never got her back. They got a stranger who politely declined to pretend otherwise. That's the chilling part of this case. It's not about a kidnapper. It's not about a conspiracy. It's about the terrifying fragility of the human brain, the realization that everything you are, everything you remember, everything that makes you, you, is stored on an organ that can, under the right amount of pressure, simply reset. Jodie Roberts didn't get lost in the woods. She got lost inside herself, and she never found her way back. Her mother buried the daughter she loved, and 12 years later, she talked to the stranger wearing that daughter's face. And even then, even with hands held and tears flowing, the only person who could ever really return was already gone. Some disappearances happen in forests, some happen in alleys, some happen in dark houses behind locked doors, and some happen entirely inside a single human skull with no witnesses, no clues, and no way home.